Undercover boss saw chef hide envelope at 5 a.m., then one look inside exposed the side business. The garbage smelled like 3-day-old fish and burnt oil. Ethan Blackwood stood at a steel sink the size of a bathtub, scrubbing a cast iron pan that hadn't been properly cleaned in what looked like weeks. His hands were raw. His back ached. And somewhere above the noise of clattering dishes and roaring exhaust fans, a line cook was arguing with a prep chef about whose fault it was that the hollandaise had broken, again. Nobody in that kitchen had any idea they were working next to a billionaire. That was exactly the point. Ethan owned 47 restaurants across the country. His name was on the company. His face was occasionally in business magazines. But right now, with a beard he'd grown out for 3 weeks, a name tag that said Eddie, and a pair of scuffed non-slip shoes he'd bought from a discount store, he looked like every other exhausted dishwasher who needed rent money by Friday. He'd gone undercover before, twice, in fact, and both times it had confirmed what he suspected. That the real story of any business never lived in the boardroom. It lived in the kitchen at midnight, in the supply room at 6 a.m., in the conversations people had when they thought no one important was listening. This time, the tip was different. 3 weeks ago, an anonymous message had arrived at corporate headquarters. Not an email. A handwritten letter, delivered through regular post. The message was short and oddly specific. Someone at the downtown branch is running a side operation. Money is moving. You need to look closer. No name. No return address. His head of operations wanted to send auditors immediately. Ethan said no. Auditors scared people into silence. He wanted the truth, not a performance of innocence. So he'd created Eddie, got himself placed in the downtown branch through a staffing agency, and started washing dishes. For 2 days, nothing unusual happened. Then came the third morning. It was 4:52 a.m. when Ethan arrived through the rear service entrance. The sky was still completely dark. The city around him was quiet except for the low hum of a delivery truck idling 2 blocks away. He had come in early to stock the dish station before the breakfast prep team arrived at 5:30. He was unlocking the gate when he heard footsteps. Measured. Deliberate. Heading away from the building, not toward it. Ethan stayed still in the shadows and watched. Marco Reyes, head chef, 12-year employee, 3-time winner of the company's internal Excellence in Service award, walked across the rear parking lot with purpose. He wasn't running. He wasn't sneaking. He moved like a man doing something he had done hundreds of times before. Comfortable. Practiced. Marco stopped at the far end of the back wall. It was an old section of the building, the original brick structure that predated the restaurant's renovation by decades. The mortar between several bricks had crumbled with age. Marco crouched down near a section close to the ground, reached into his jacket, and pulled out a thick envelope. He pressed it into the gap between 2 loose bricks. Patted it once, like he was tucking something in for the night. Then stood, straightened his jacket, and walked back inside through the side door. The whole thing took under 40 seconds. Ethan didn't move for a long moment. His mind was already running the calculations. A hidden envelope. Before sunrise. No witnesses. If this was what it looked like, Marco had just handed him the entire case on a plate. He crossed the parking lot quietly, crouched at the same section of wall, and pulled the envelope free. It was heavier than he expected. He carried it inside to the utility room, locked the door, and opened it under the single hanging bulb. The first thing he saw was cash. Thick stacks of it, bound with rubber bands. Hundreds, mostly. His first instinct tightened in his chest. There it is. But then something else caught his eye and stopped him completely. Letters. Dozens of them, folded carefully and packed in alongside the money. Small sheets of paper, some lined, some plain. Some written in careful adult handwriting. Others in the large, uneven print of a child still learning how to hold a pen. He unfolded the first one. Dear helper, my mom cried when she found out I didn't have to leave school. I don't know who you are, but I pray for you every night. Destiny, age 9 inch. He unfolded another. Thank you for paying for my science books. I want to be a doctor one day. I will remember this forever. And another. Because of you, I can stay in school. Tucked behind the letters were receipts. School tuition payments. Uniform invoices. A registration fee for a science summer camp. Photographs, small and slightly faded, of children in school uniforms smiling at the camera. Kids who had no idea their photo had ended up folded inside an envelope hidden inside a restaurant wall. Ethan sat down slowly on an overturned crate. The cash he'd expected. The letters he had not. He'd come here looking for a thief. What he was holding looked nothing like evidence of a crime. It looked like evidence of something else entirely. Something that had been quietly running for a long time, carefully hidden not out of guilt, but out of something he hadn't considered yet. He put everything back exactly as he'd found it, sealed the envelope, and returned it to the wall before the first prep cook arrived. He needed more before he made a single move. Because if he was wrong about Marco Reyes, he was about to destroy a man who deserved the opposite. And if he was right, then nothing about this story was going to end the way anyone expected. The letters had addresses. Not all of them, but enough. Some were written on the back of torn notebook pages with nothing but a first name and a prayer. But several, the more formal ones, the typed receipts and tuition invoices, carried full names, street addresses, school names, zip codes. Ethan photographed everything on his phone before returning the envelope to the wall. That evening, after his shift ended and the smell of dish soap had soaked through his skin, he sat in his parked car 3 blocks from the restaurant and studied the images one by one. 7 addresses. 4 different neighborhoods. All within the city. He told no one. Not his assistant. Not his head of operations. Not the company lawyer who had been on standby since the anonymous letter arrived. Whatever this was, it deserved to be understood before it was reported. He started the next morning. The first address took him to a narrow street on the east side of the city where the houses sat close together like they were keeping each other warm. He found the door without trouble. A pale yellow house with a cracked front step and a window box that had seen better seasons. He knocked. A woman answered. Mid-30s, tired eyes, wearing scrubs like she'd just come off a night shift or was about to start one. Behind her, through the half-open door, Ethan could see a young girl at a kitchen table doing homework with the kind of focused silence that only children who understand struggle ever manage. Ethan introduced himself as a journalist working on a community interest story. It wasn't entirely a lie. He was looking for a story. He just hadn't decided yet what kind. The woman's name was Patricia. Her daughter was Destiny, the same Destiny who had written the letter about her mother crying. Patricia didn't ask many questions. She seemed like someone who had grown used to keeping things close to the chest. But when Ethan mentioned the scholarship help her daughter had received 2 years ago, something shifted in her face. The tiredness didn't leave, but something softer moved in behind it. "We never found out who did it," she said quietly. "One morning the school called and said Destiny's balance had been cleared. Uniforms, books, everything. I thought it was a mistake. I called back 3 times. She shook her head slowly. They just kept saying it was taken care of. By a private donor. Anonymous. Ethan asked if anyone had ever reached out afterward. Any follow-up, any contact? Patricia shook her head again. Not once. Whoever it was didn't want anything back. The second address was across town. A ground-floor apartment in a building that buzzed with the noise of several families living in close quarters. The man who answered was named Joseph, a broad-shouldered immigrant from West Africa who had arrived in the country 6 years ago with his wife and young son. His son, Daniel, had wanted to attend a 2-week science and engineering camp the previous summer. The registration fee was $400. Between Joseph's warehouse shifts and his wife's cleaning work, $400 was a gap that didn't close easily. Then, without explanation, an envelope had arrived at Daniel's school, cash, exact amount, with a note that said only, "For Daniel's camp. No need to return anything." Joseph sat with Ethan at a small table and described the moment his son had come home after the camp with a model bridge he'd built himself, talking faster than Joseph had ever heard him talk. "He wants to be an engineer now," Joseph said. "Before the camp, he didn't even know what engineers did." He looked at Ethan carefully. "You said you're writing a story about this?" "I'm trying to understand it," Ethan said honestly. Joseph nodded slowly. "Then write it right." By the fourth day, Ethan had visited 5 of the 7 addresses. A teenager named Marcus who had received money for university entrance exam fees, and who was now in his first year of an engineering program upstate. His grandmother, who had raised him alone, wept quietly when she talked about it. A family whose youngest daughter had nearly been pulled out of her school's music program before an anonymous payment covered her instrument rental and lessons for the full year. The girl was now preparing for a regional competition. Each story was different. Each family had been helped at a moment when giving up had seemed like the only option. And in every single case, the donor had vanished completely. No name. No follow-up call. No expectation of gratitude. What struck Ethan wasn't just the generosity. It was the architecture of it. This wasn't someone writing a check from a comfortable desk. This was someone who knew which children were close to falling through the cracks. Someone with access to schools, to communities, to information that didn't circulate publicly. Someone who had, over years, built a quiet and invisible system. 8 years, he calculated from the dates on the oldest receipts. Whoever was behind this had been doing it for 8 years without a single person finding out. Until now. Back in his car that evening, Ethan stared at the restaurant on the corner. The lights in the kitchen were still on. Through the window he could see the silhouette of a tall man moving between the stations with the easy authority of someone completely at home. Marco Reyes didn't look like a thief. He looked like a man with a secret that was far heavier, and far more expensive, than anyone around him understood. And somewhere inside that building, the quarterly audit had just been scheduled. The audit date was confirmed on a Tuesday. Ethan heard it from a shift manager who mentioned it casually while counting cutlery near the service station. "Corporate's sending people in 3 weeks, so everyone better make sure their stations are documented." The manager said it the way people announce mild weather. Routine. Expected. But Ethan watched Marco across the kitchen when the words landed. The chef didn't flinch. Didn't look up from the sauce he was reducing. His expression didn't change by a single degree. But his hand, the one holding the spoon, slowed for just a half-second before resuming its steady rhythm. That half-second told Ethan everything. Marco knew exactly what an audit would find. And he had no intention of stopping. The following morning, Ethan didn't go to the wall. Instead, he waited. He arrived earlier than usual, before 4:30, and positioned himself in the shadow of the fire exit stairwell across the rear lot, close enough to see clearly, far enough to disappear into the dark. The city was silent in that particular way it gets in the last hour before the world remembers itself. No traffic. No voices. Just the distant pulse of a signal light changing colors for no one. At 5:03 a.m., Marco appeared. Same jacket. Same unhurried walk. But this morning he didn't stop at the wall. He kept moving, past the lot, through the side gate, and toward a battered gray sedan parked on the service road behind the building. Ethan followed on foot, staying half a block back. Marco drove for 20 minutes through the waking city. Ethan followed in his own car, keeping 2 vehicles between them at all times. They crossed the river bridge, moved through a neighborhood of low commercial buildings and corner shops with their metal shutters still down, and eventually stopped near a large bus station on the western edge of downtown. Marco parked, climbed out, and walked into the station with the same calm purpose he carried everywhere. Ethan followed him inside. The station was half alive at this hour. A few travelers slumped in plastic chairs, a cleaning crew working slowly across the far end of the hall, a coffee kiosk just raising its shutter. Marco moved through the space without looking around, went directly to a row of wooden benches near the east wall, and crouched beside the third one from the left. He slid a fresh envelope beneath it. Thick. Sealed. Then he stood, bought a coffee from the kiosk, unhurried, like a man with a completely clear conscience, and walked back to his car. Ethan stayed. He sat 2 rows back and watched the bench. 40 minutes passed. He bought a terrible coffee of his own and waited. At 6:20, a woman arrived. 60, perhaps older. Silver hair pulled back neatly. She wore a long coat and carried a canvas tote bag with the logo of a local school district printed on the side. She sat at the bench, reached underneath without bending down to look, and slipped the envelope into her tote bag in one smooth motion. Then she opened a paperback novel and read for 10 minutes before leaving. Ethan followed her. Her name, he discovered over the next 2 hours, was Eleanor Marsh. Retired principal. 31 years in the city's public school system. Now she spent 3 mornings a week volunteering at a small community center 2 miles from the bus station, a converted church hall that offered after-school tutoring, weekend study programs, and a resource library for low-income students. Ethan watched from outside as Eleanor arrived at the center and was greeted at the door by a young social worker. They spoke briefly. Eleanor passed her the envelope. The social worker took it inside. He waited another hour before approaching. He introduced himself again as a journalist. The social worker, cautious at first, eventually led him to a back office where Eleanor was sorting donated books into labeled boxes. When Ethan sat down and explained, carefully and honestly, what he had seen, Eleanor studied him for a long time before she spoke. "You followed Marco," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." She set down the book in her hands. "How much do you know?" "Not enough," Ethan said. "That's why I'm here." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she told him. The network had no name, no registration, no bank account. It moved entirely in cash to protect the families involved, many of whom were undocumented, or in situations where sudden financial attention could create dangerous complications. Marco wasn't the only contributor, but he was the engine. Teachers fed him names quietly. Social workers flagged urgent cases. Volunteers like Eleanor moved the resources to where they were needed. No single person knew the full picture. That was intentional. "If someone is ever questioned," Eleanor said carefully, "they can only describe their own small piece. The children stay protected. The families stay safe." Ethan sat back. 8 years. Dozens of people. Hundreds of children. All of it running invisibly beneath the surface of ordinary city life. "Does Marco know you're all doing this for him?" Ethan asked. Eleanor smiled for the first time. It was a small, tired smile. "Marco thinks he built this to protect the children," she said. "What he doesn't know is that we built the rest of it to protect him." Ethan drove back to the restaurant in silence. The audit was now 2 weeks away. And Marco still had no idea the walls were closing in. They came on a Wednesday. Nobody had been told the exact day. That was deliberate. Ethan knew how corporate audits worked because he had designed this one himself, years ago, after a financial irregularity at a branch in the Northeast had gone undetected for 14 months. The policy since then was simple. No advance notice. No time to clean anything up. Auditors arrived like weather. 3 of them. Suits, laptops, a rolling case of printed ledgers. They set up in the manager's office before the breakfast rush ended and started pulling records before lunch. Ethan watched from the dish station, scrubbing plates, saying nothing. By mid-afternoon, the kitchen felt different. It wasn't loud or dramatic. Nobody was shouting. But there was a particular tension that moves through a workplace when people sense something serious is happening behind a closed door, a tightening in the air, conversations that stopped a sentence too early, eyes that moved toward the manager's office and quickly looked away. Marco ran service the same way he always did. Precise. Calm. He called out orders, corrected a timing error on the grill station, tasted a soup and adjusted the seasoning without comment. From the outside, he looked completely untouchable. But Ethan noticed the tells. The way Marco's jaw held slightly tighter than usual. The single moment between services when he stood at the pass, completely still, staring at nothing for 3 full seconds before snapping back. The way he didn't take his usual coffee break at 4 o'clock. Small things. The kind only someone watching closely would catch. At 5:15, the lead auditor, a thin man named Gerald with reading glasses pushed permanently up his forehead, stepped out of the office and asked the floor manager to send Marco in when service wrapped. The floor manager relayed the message loud enough that half the kitchen heard it. Nobody said a word. Ethan lingered after his shift ended, pretending to clean behind the service cart near the hallway. He couldn't hear what was said inside the office. But he didn't need to. 40 minutes later, Marco walked out alone, and the expression on his face said everything a transcript could not. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the particular stillness of a man who had just been asked a question he had decided, long ago, he would never answer. Gerald appeared in the doorway behind him. "We'll need you available tomorrow morning, chef. There are figures here we can't reconcile without explanation." Marco nodded once. "I'll be here." He picked up his knife roll from the hook beside the pass, tucked it under his arm, and walked out through the back door into the evening. Ethan gave it 2 minutes before following. He found Marco sitting on the rear step of the building, the same step that faced the old brick wall, not looking at the wall, just sitting quietly with his elbows on his knees and his eyes somewhere in the middle distance. Ethan sat down beside him. Marco glanced sideways. "Long day for a dishwasher. Long day for everyone," Ethan said. Marco almost smiled. Almost. Then he looked back at whatever invisible point he'd been staring at and said nothing more. They sat like that for a while. 2 men in the dark behind a restaurant. The city moved quietly around them. Somewhere nearby a child was being called in for dinner, a mother's voice carrying over a fence, warm and impatient in equal measure. Ethan thought about saying something. He had the words ready. He'd been rehearsing variations of the truth for days. But he wasn't ready yet. And neither, he sensed, was Marco. The next 2 days moved fast and badly. The auditors pulled every financial record connected to the downtown branch for the past 4 years. Cash flows from the restaurant's charity fundraiser nights. Employee collection drives. The donation jars that sat on the host stand during the holiday season. Supplier discrepancies. Inventory gaps. Taken individually, each entry had an explanation. Taken together, without context, they formed a pattern that looked, to 3 people with spreadsheets and no knowledge of hidden envelopes, deeply suspicious. A senior executive flew in from the company's regional office. His name was Richard, and he had the energy of a man who enjoyed arriving at conclusions quickly. Within hours of reviewing the preliminary findings, Richard was using words like systematic and deliberate concealment in conversations Ethan was not supposed to be hearing. By Friday morning, Marco had been formally suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. The announcement went to staff via a brief internal memo. It said nothing specific. It didn't need to. In a kitchen, a memo about a suspended chef reads like a verdict whether it means to or not. Ethan stood at his station and watched the team absorb it. Some said nothing and kept working. A few exchanged glances that carried quiet outrage. One of the younger line cooks, a kid named Theo who had worked under Marco for 2 years, put down his knife, stared at the floor for a long moment, then picked it back up without a word. The envelope was still in the wall. Marco was gone. And somewhere across the city, a network of teachers, volunteers, and families had no idea that the person holding everything together had just been suspended for the exact kindness they had spent 8 years helping him hide. The document was easy to miss. It had been tucked inside the 3rd envelope Ethan had photographed, not a letter from a child, not a tuition receipt, but a folded sheet of aged paper that looked like it had been carried around for years before being placed there. The creases were soft from repeated folding and unfolding. The ink had faded at the edges. It was a school report card. Marco Reyes. Age 15. Hillcrest Secondary School, Milford Township. Most of the grades were excellent. But stamped across the bottom in red ink were 4 words that stopped Ethan cold. Enrollment suspended, fees outstanding. He noticed it on the first day but hadn't understood its weight. Now, sitting in his car outside the suspended chef's empty restaurant on a gray Saturday morning, he understood it completely. He typed Milford Township into his navigation system. 3 hours away. He started driving. Milford was the kind of town that had once meant something and was still quietly insisting it did. A main street with a hardware store, a diner, a post office, and a pharmacy that doubled as a greeting card shop. A water tower with the town name painted in letters that had been touched up recently enough to suggest civic pride hadn't entirely given up. Houses set back from wide roads, most of them old, most of them well kept in the particular way that requires constant effort rather than money. Ethan stopped at the diner first. He ordered coffee, mentioned he was researching a community story, and asked if anyone remembered a family named Reyes from 20-something years ago. The woman behind the counter, 50s, reading glasses on a beaded chain, didn't hesitate. Maria Reyes? Sure. She worked at the textile plant on Route 9 until it closed. Raised her boy alone after her husband passed. Moved away maybe 15, 16 years ago. She paused. The boy did well for himself, I heard. Chef somewhere in the city. Do you remember anyone who helped them? Ethan asked carefully. When things were difficult? The woman set down the coffee pot and thought about it. You'd want to talk to someone at Hillcrest, she said finally. The school. There was a teacher there, Mr. Calloway. He was the one who looked out for kids who were struggling. Everyone knew it, nobody talked about it much. She picked up the pot again. He passed a few years back. But his daughter still lives here. Ruth. She runs the pharmacy across the street. Ruth Calloway was perhaps 40, with her father's thoughtful eyes and the unhurried manner of someone who had grown up watching a parent give without expectation. She listened to Ethan without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, then reached beneath the pharmacy counter and produced a worn photograph album without a word, as if she had been waiting for someone to come and ask. She turned to a page near the middle and placed it on the counter facing him. A school photograph. Rows of teenagers in uniform, slightly awkward, slightly hopeful in the way that 15-year-olds are when they don't yet know what the world intends for them. Ruth pointed to a boy in the second row. Tall, lean, dark-haired, with the kind of serious expression that looks like concentration rather than sadness. That's Marco, she said. He was about to drop out. His mother couldn't pay the outstanding fees and the school was going to turn him away at the start of the new term. And your father stopped that. My father paid the fees himself, Ruth said simply. Out of his own salary. He also bought Marco's textbooks, his uniform replacement, and arranged for a small monthly contribution through the school's discretionary account so it wouldn't be visible to other students. She looked at the photograph. He never told Marco. He never told anyone. I only found out after he died, going through his records. Ethan looked at the boy in the photograph for a long time. Did it change things? For Marco? Ruth almost laughed, but it came out soft instead. He went from nearly leaving school to finishing top of his class. Got a culinary scholarship 2 years later. Sent my father a letter when he got his first professional kitchen job. She turned to another page in the album. The letter was there, preserved behind clear plastic. Handwritten. 2 pages. Ethan read the last paragraph without touching it. I don't know if you'll remember me, sir, but I remember you every single day. You gave me something I didn't earn and couldn't repay. I've decided the only honest response to that is to spend the rest of my life making sure someone else gets the same chance you gave me. I promise I won't stop. The letter was dated 21 years ago. Marco had kept that promise without missing a single year. Ethan stood in that small pharmacy in a small town 3 hours from the city, and for the first time since he'd started washing dishes and following chefs through bus stations and reading children's letters by a single hanging bulb, he felt the full weight of what he was standing in the middle of. This wasn't a side business. This was a 21-year-old promise written by a 15-year-old boy who had never forgotten what it felt like to almost lose everything. And in 2 weeks, unless Ethan did something, That promise was going to be buried under a corporate audit. He drove back to the city before dark. He had work to do. The call came on a Monday morning. Ethan was in his car outside the restaurant, still playing Eddie the dishwasher for 2 more days, still watching, still waiting for the right moment, when his phone buzzed with a message from Eleanor Marsh. It was 3 words. "We have a problem." He met her an hour later at the community center. She was standing outside when he arrived, which told him the problem was serious enough that she hadn't wanted to say it inside where others might hear. "Word travels fast in this network," she said, skipping any greeting. "Marco's suspension leaked to 3 of our contact teachers by Friday evening. By Sunday night, the contribution chain had already stopped." Ethan waited. Eleanor looked at him steadily. "We have 7 students with tuition deadlines in the next 18 days. 3 of them are midterm. If the payments don't arrive, the schools will suspend their enrollment." She paused. "One of them is sitting a university entrance scholarship exam in 11 days. If she loses her school place before that exam, she can't sit it." "What's her name?" Ethan asked. "Amara. 17 years old. Her teachers have been describing her as one of the most gifted students they've seen in a decade." Eleanor's voice stayed level, but her hands tightened around the strap of her canvas bag. "She doesn't know any of this is happening. She's at home right now, preparing for the most important exam of her life, with no idea that the floor is about to disappear beneath her." Ethan spent the rest of that day watching the collapse happen in real time. It wasn't dramatic. That was the cruel part. Nobody shouted. Nothing broke. It happened the way a river dries up in a drought, gradually, quietly, until one morning you look and realize the water is simply gone. A teacher named Mr. Osei, who had been feeding Marco names of struggling students for 4 years, sent a message through Eleanor saying he couldn't risk his position with an active corporate investigation circling nearby. 2 volunteers who had been running cash drops to families withdrew without explanation. A social worker who coordinated 3 of the most urgent cases stopped responding to messages entirely. Each person was making a reasonable decision for themselves. Together, those reasonable decisions were dismantling 8 years of careful construction in less than a week. Ethan sat with Eleanor in the back office of the community center and looked at the list she placed in front of him. 7 names. 7 children. Ages ranging from 9 to 17. Beside each name, a number. The outstanding amount needed. The deadline. The total across all 7 was less than what Ethan spent monthly on parking at his headquarters building. He looked up from the list. Eleanor was already looking at him. "I know who you are," she said quietly. Ethan stilled. "I've known since the second time you came here," she continued, without accusation, without performance. "Eddie the dishwasher doesn't drive a car that costs more than most people's houses, and he doesn't ask questions the way someone does who already knows half the answers." She folded her hands on the table. "I didn't say anything because I needed to know what you were going to do with what you found." The room was very quiet. "What do you think I'm going to do?" Ethan asked. "I think you came here today because you already know what's right," Eleanor said. "I think you drove 3 hours to a small town to understand a man before you judged him. And I think you're sitting in this room, in this community center, looking at this list of children's names, because whatever you came looking for when you started all this, it isn't what you're holding anymore." Ethan looked at the list again. Amara. 17. Scholarship exam in 11 days. He thought about a 15-year-old boy in a school photograph with a suspension stamp in red ink across his report card. He thought about a teacher who had quietly paid fees from his own salary and never said a word. He thought about a letter preserved behind clear plastic in a pharmacy in a small town. "I promise I won't stop." "Cover the 7 payments," Ethan said. "All of them. Today. Through whatever channel keeps the families protected." He stood. "And make sure Amara sits that exam." Eleanor nodded once. Nothing more. But the crisis wasn't finished. That evening, Ethan received a different kind of news. Richard, the executive who had flown in to oversee the audit, had escalated the case to the company's legal team. The language had shifted from investigation to prosecution. The word fraud had appeared in an internal memo. Marco hadn't engaged a lawyer. He hadn't made a single statement. He had, according to the floor manager who still texted Ethan under the pretense of shift coordination, simply gone home and not spoken to anyone. The network was surviving, barely, and only because Ethan had quietly stepped in. But Marco was running out of time. And Ethan understood now that fixing the immediate crisis was only half the battle. The other half was harder. It required him to walk into a room full of executives and dismantle an assumption that had already hardened into near certainty. He needed evidence, witnesses, documentation, and truth delivered in a room where people had already decided they knew the ending. He needed to move fast. He picked up his phone and called his assistant for the first time in 3 weeks. "Clear my schedule," he said. "All of it. Starting tomorrow." Ethan called Marco on a Tuesday evening. No introduction. No preamble. Just an address, a quiet coffee shop 3 blocks from the restaurant, and a time. 7 o'clock. Marco arrived 4 minutes early, which told Ethan something about the kind of man he was dealing with. He was wearing a plain jacket, no chef whites, and he looked like someone who hadn't been sleeping well but was determined not to show it. He scanned the room when he entered, found Ethan at the corner table, and walked over without hesitation. He sat down. He looked at Ethan across the table. And then Ethan removed the name tag from his pocket, the one that said Eddie, and placed it flat on the table between them. Marco stared at it for a long moment. Something shifted in his face. Not shock exactly. More like a man who had been waiting for a second shoe to drop and had finally heard it. "How long?" Marco asked quietly. 3 weeks, Ethan said. Marco nodded slowly, the way people do when a thing they feared turns out to be exactly as bad as they imagined. He looked at the table. Then he looked up. "Then I'm fired." "No," Ethan said. "You're not. But I need everything. Every record, every receipt, every name you're willing to share. Every donation log, every letter, every tuition payment for the past 8 years. I need it documented, organized, and ready to present." He paused. "Because in 5 days, I'm walking into a board meeting, and I need the truth to be louder than the assumption." Marco was very still. "If I give you names," he said carefully, "families get exposed. Undocumented families. Vulnerable families." "I know," Ethan said. "We present numbers, not names. Documented totals, verified receipts, donation sources, everything that proves the money was legal and accounted for. The families stay invisible. The truth doesn't." A long silence passed between them. Then Marco reached into his jacket and placed a small key on the table beside the name tag. "Storage unit," he said. 8 years of records. I kept everything." They worked for 4 straight days. Marco's storage unit was a 10 by 10 room on the 3rd floor of a facility near the river, and it was the most organized space Ethan had seen outside of a professional archive. Bankers' boxes labeled by year. Folders divided by category, donations received, payments made, school communications. A handwritten ledger for every year going back to the beginning, each entry dated, sourced, and accounted for to the last dollar. Ethan brought in his personal assistant and a financial consultant he trusted completely. They worked in shifts, photographing, cataloging, cross-referencing. Eleanor Marsh provided signed statements from 11 volunteers. 3 school administrators wrote formal letters confirming receipt of scholarship payments and their legitimacy. A local accountant who had quietly advised the network pro bono for 6 years provided a complete independent audit of every transaction. They also gathered people. Not for sympathy. For truth. Ethan reached out carefully, through Eleanor, through Mr. Osei, through the network's quiet channels. He asked former scholarship recipients, those who were now adults, now working, now in positions to speak, if they were willing to appear. Not to perform their gratitude. Simply to exist in a room and let their lives speak for themselves. 14 said yes within 24 hours. 3 more said yes by the following morning. The board meeting was held on a Friday at company headquarters. 12 executives. Gerald the auditor. Richard, who had already drafted a termination recommendation with the legal team's signature on it. 2 company lawyers. Ethan walked in last. He was not dressed like Eddie the dishwasher. He took his seat at the head of the table, looked around the room, and said nothing for a moment. Long enough that Richard shifted in his chair. "Before we begin," Ethan said, "I'd like to introduce some people." The door opened. They came in quietly. A young woman in nursing scrubs, Destiny, now 22, working her first hospital placement. A young man in a university sweatshirt carrying a model bridge he'd built at a science camp 7 years ago. A teacher. A mother. An engineer 2 years out of university who had once been 3 days from losing his school place. They stood along the wall. They didn't make speeches. They simply stood there. And then Ethan presented the evidence. It took 90 minutes. Every donation source verified. Every payment cross-referenced. Every dollar tracked from its origin to its destination. The independent audit confirmation. The volunteer statements. The school letters. When he finished, the room was completely silent. Richard was staring at the table. Gerald had removed his glasses and was pressing his fingers against his eyes. "Every dollar," Ethan said quietly, "was legally donated by customers, employees, and community members who gave willingly. Every payment reached a real child. Every record was kept. The only thing Marco Reyes is guilty of is spending 8 years making sure nobody found out, because the moment people found out, the families he was protecting became visible. And visible meant vulnerable." He let that sit. Then he said, "The man you were about to prosecute built something most companies spend millions trying to fake in press releases. He built it quietly, personally, and at significant cost to himself. I went undercover looking for a thief." He paused. "I found the opposite." Nobody spoke for a long time. The young nurse near the wall was looking at her hands. The engineer was very still. Outside the window, the city moved on, indifferent and unhurried. Inside the room, something irreversible had just happened. Marco was reinstated on a Monday. No press release. No internal announcement with carefully chosen corporate language about lessons learned and moving forward. Just a phone call from Ethan, direct and simple. "Come back Tuesday. Your kitchen misses you." Marco arrived at 5:30 a.m., same as always. The morning prep team was already there. Nobody made a speech. Theo, the young line cook who had put down his knife and stared at the floor the day the suspension memo landed, simply nodded once when Marco walked in and went back to his mise en place. The sous chef handed him his apron without a word. That was enough. That was everything. But Ethan wasn't finished. He had walked into that board meeting 5 days ago and dismantled an assumption. What he'd built in its place was going to take longer and matter more. He spent the following 3 weeks in conversations that most CEOs delegate to committees. He sat with Eleanor Marsh for 2 full afternoons, mapping the network structure, understanding its pressure points, learning where it was fragile and where it was strong. He met individually with Mr. Osei and 4 other teachers who had been quietly feeding names into the system for years. He visited the community center 3 times. He wasn't studying the network to absorb it. He was studying it to protect it. Because the thing Ethan understood, standing in that storage unit surrounded by 8 years of Marco's handwritten ledgers, was that institutional money could destroy a thing like this just as easily as a corporate audit could. The wrong kind of funding brought visibility. Visibility brought bureaucracy. Bureaucracy brought forms and committees and approval chains, and somewhere in that machinery the 15 children on Eleanor's current list became case numbers instead of kids who needed school books by Thursday. So he built something that sat beside the network without replacing it. The foundation took 4 months to structure properly. Ethan funded it personally, not through the company, not through a marketing budget with the foundation's name on restaurant receipts. His own money, a significant and non-public amount, placed into an independently governed trust with a board that included Eleanor, 2 school administrators, a child welfare lawyer, and Ruth Calloway, the pharmacist's daughter from Milford Township, who accepted the invitation with a quiet steadiness that reminded Ethan of her father. The foundation was named the Calloway Trust. Not after the restaurant group. Not after Ethan. After a schoolteacher from a small town who had paid a 15-year-old boy's fees from his own salary and never mentioned it to anyone. Marco was asked to serve as Director of Community Outreach, a role that kept him in the kitchen every morning and in the city's schools and community centers every afternoon. He accepted on one condition. "The network stays separate," he said. "The trust funds what it funds. The network does what it does. They don't overlap." Ethan agreed immediately. He understood. The trust was infrastructure. The network was something older and more human. Both needed to exist. Neither could replace the other. The first annual Calloway Trust ceremony was held on a Saturday morning in early spring, in the hall of a school that had been sending names to Marco for 6 years. 340 scholarship recipients attended. Some were current students receiving their first award letters. Others were adults, teachers, nurses, engineers, small business owners, who had received help years ago and come back to stand in the same room where it had all quietly begun for them. Amara was there. She had sat her university scholarship exam 11 days after Ethan had told Eleanor to cover the payments. She had scored the highest mark in the city. The letter from the university was framed now, hanging in her mother's kitchen in a house where the walls had heard a lot of difficult years. She stood at the front of the hall and spoke for 4 minutes. She didn't mention Marco by name. He had asked her not to. In a brief conversation she described later as the strangest and most moving 4 minutes of her life. She spoke instead about what it meant to have someone believe in your future before you had proven anything. To receive something you hadn't earned yet. To understand, because of that, what you owed the world going forward. When she finished, the room was very quiet. In the second row, Marco sat with his hands folded, looking at the floor. Ethan watched him from the side of the room. Afterward, when the hall had mostly emptied and the remaining voices had softened to the comfortable murmur of people who have shared something real, Ethan saw Marco standing near the back wall, slightly apart from the remaining crowd. A boy was standing nearby. 10, perhaps 11. Small for his age, wearing a school uniform that was slightly too large, standing with the careful stillness of a child who has learned that the safest way to exist in a room full of adults is to take up as little space as possible. Marco noticed him the way a person notices something that reminds them of themselves. Completely. Instantly. He walked over. Crouched down to the boy's level. They spoke quietly for a minute, 2 minutes. Ethan couldn't hear the words. Then Marco reached into his jacket and handed the boy a sealed envelope. The boy opened it slowly. Inside was a scholarship acceptance letter for the coming school year. The boy read it once. Then again. Then he looked up at Marco with an expression that had no name in any language, the particular look of someone who has just discovered that the world contains more kindness than they had prepared themselves for. Marco straightened up, nodded once, and walked away before the boy could say thank you. It was the same way Mr. Calloway had always done it. Some things, Ethan realized, didn't need to be taught. They simply passed, from one person to the next, through a sealed envelope, a quiet moment, an act so small it fit in a jacket pocket, and so large it changed the entire direction of a life. He thought about a brick wall behind a restaurant. A thick envelope hidden before sunrise. A dishwasher crouching in the dark, expecting to find a crime. He had found something instead that he hadn't known he was missing. And standing in that school hall, watching a boy read his future for the very first time, Ethan Blackwood understood that the most important thing he had ever done for his company had nothing to do with revenue, or expansion, or quarterly results. It was following a chef out of a back door at 5 in the morning. And choosing, when he found the truth, to protect it instead of prosecute it. And,